more about these studies and the important results they've produced throughout the day, but I'll briefly introduce two of them. The first, the Cuba Perspective Study of 150,000 adults, is led by Drs. Alfredo Dueñas and Nuris Armas. And the second, the Mexico City Perspective Study, 150,000 adults in a blood-based cohort, is led by Drs. Jesus Alegre and Pablo Curi. I'll briefly present one finding from each of these studies that shows why the continued study of smoking in diverse populations globally is so important. So here we have the association between age-started smoking and all-cause mortality, premature mortality before 70 in Cuba. It's all over the world and highlights the harms of smoking initiation in early adulthood and especially in childhood. Here we have the association between cigarettes smoked per day at base for countries all over the world with low smoking intensity. There is no safe level of smoking because smoking takes time to develop in terms of risk. But quitting works. And so widespread adult cessation can avoid remaining global health priorities. In closing, I see this number as a challenge. I'd like to spend my 110th birthday in the year 2100 giving a talk about how many of these deaths, these billion deaths, we managed to prevent, inspired primarily by the brilliant work of Sir Richard Peto. Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, I could use this one, thank you. I first met Richard Peto in 1986 on a plane coming back from the International Cancer Congress in Budapest in Hungary. I was sitting across the aisle from Richard, and Richard was sitting next to Julian. And I can only describe what we had as a blazing row on the plane, to the extent that the stewardess came up and said, is there anything the matter? Can I help you in any way? Because Hong Kong, where I've lived for 50 years, had just banned smokeless tobacco. It was a new form of tobacco being introduced into the market, and we blazed it. We banned it. And Richard thought that harm reduction was an area worth exploring. He did not agree with this at all. And nobody was telling me we fought the American government to do it. We banned smokeless tobacco, and nobody was telling me it was a good idea. It was a bad idea. So when we got off the plane, Julian, with great courtesy, said, it's been very nice meeting you. I hope we'll meet up if you're ever in London. I said, ditto from Hong Kong. And Richard and I stomped off the plane without speaking to each other. But the reality is that since then, I've worked with Richard a lot in China. And just remember what China was like. These were the very early days. The picture right up on the top left is an example of British-American tobacco in the 1910s, advertising tobacco. They saw it as their prime market, rapidly followed by the indigenous tobacco companies in China, starting to advertise as well. And the foreign tobacco companies recognized China as really a dream come true. No discussion of the tobacco industry in the year 2000 would be complete without addressing what may be the most important feature on the landscape, the China market. And that's where they set their sights. So when Richard and I started working in China, we were faced with a barrage of foreign advertising all over the place, of sponsorship of sports events, sponsorship of schools, joint ventures with the foreign tobacco companies. That is the background in which we started to work on tobacco control. And of course, in those days, the Chinese leaders smoked. In 1981, Peto first visited China and was definitely ahead of the pack in that regard. But he applied this Peto principle from the days with Dole. Document the big problems, document how much bigger they are than other problems, use the data for public health action, and build capacity within the countries, which was really important. And in China, getting the data, he persuaded the late Minister of Health, Chen Minjiang, that tobacco was and would be a major problem. He started the prospective studies in the 90s. The China Kadoorie Biobank was set up in the 2010s, and I very privileged to be involved with the birth of this initiation because I knew the Kadoorie family personally very well in Hong Kong and was able, with Richard, to persuade them to give a seed grant of $6 million to get the Kadoorie Bank up and running. And the Kadoorie Biobank is now institutionalized to provide data for the next half century in China. But our work, and Richard's work in particular, of talking to the Minister of Health, led to the first national prevalence study in China in 1984 by the late Professor Ong Xing-je. The next thing that happened was in 1987, China decided to have a national conference. And it was deemed that tobacco was far too sensitive a subject to hold this conference in Beijing. So we all had to troop down the river to Tianjin. And at the conference, they said, well, we are happy looking at some of the studies, we're happy looking at children and school education, but we certainly don't really want a tobacco law. But in the course of that conference, it became very clear that what China did indeed need was a national tobacco law. And Richard and I, with a computer in those days, which this is really what it looked like. We had one line we could see on the computer. We actually drafted the first national tobacco law for China, which was then subsequently adopted, and stayed up all night to try and get this law done before the conference finished and it was endorsed. And this, in fact, what Richard and I managed to draft became the basis for the first national tobacco law in China, which covered research, it covered education, it covered issues like ingredients, banning some of the advertising, and some smoke-free areas. This is the very early days, so this was really important. In 1990, China then established the first and only, to this day, national NGO on tobacco, the Chinese Association on Smoking and Health. And if you look at the particular ceremony there, you'll see Richard speaking, but obviously we had work and play. And this is with Mike Daub and Professor T.H. Lam and the late colleague of ours from Australia, Dr. Gray. So we look as if we're singing some sort of song, but we're clearly enjoying ourselves as well. But Richard, perhaps a bit unlike Sir Richard Dole, was very much into advocacy. And it was obviously very important in a country like China to try and work from the top down. So we had multiple meetings, several meetings, in fact, with Madame Julin, who was the wife of the Premier, Li Peng. And I show this picture, somebody mentioned earlier about strewing documents all over the floor. I don't think Julin had ever had anybody in her office who strewed all these documents all over the floor so that there was a positive carpet of data and information with which to persuade her that China really needed to take urgent action. Richard was not with me, but I went on to meet Li Peng himself. And that, again, was a very important moment to get a very, very senior imprinter on tobacco control in China. Then in 1997 came the World Conference on Tobacco Health held in China. And at that stage, it was particularly nice because the work of Richard and myself was recognized as to what we were actually doing in that country. In 2012, I had 3 days' notice, and I was in South Korea at the time. I had 3 days' notice to put together a delegation to go and meet the Party School in China. Now, the Party School is the ideological think tank of the Communist Party in China and occupies a very large area in the northwest of the city. And it's where all the senior cadres and department heads and ministers go for training, both in their topic, if you're to become a Minister of Health, but also in terms of ideological persuasion too. And under Xi Jinping, who at the time was the head of the Party School, before he went to even higher places, he had decided that the Party School would look into tobacco. And they put together the most remarkable 230-page document on what should be done about tobacco in China. And we were called in. I was asked to find 15 people to go with 3 days' notice to Beijing to meet with the Party School to look at this document. And actually, we made almost no changes to it. Richard himself was not able to come, but he asked Dr. Chen Zhengming to come along on his behalf and represent Oxford at that meeting. And I have to say, we found very little to say about this document. It was an extraordinary document. They had philosophers and they had economists, not a medical person in sight, putting together this document on what should happen about tobacco control in China. But what they were particularly interested in was implementation. How do we implement smoke-free areas? Is it the police? Is it volunteers? Is it the Ministry of Health who should do this? And they were very interested in the experience of countries like the UK, which Chen represented, and others. And when I asked the party school, what's the status of this document that came out? I said, is the Ministry of Health obliged to do what you recommend that they do? And he said, well, let me put it this way. He said, 20 years ago, he said, we produced a paper on economic reform in China. In other words, it just happens. If the party school endorses it, it sort of slides itself into national policy and becomes the rule. So that was a very, again, a very significant moment in China. And following the party school report, I won't go into any of these details, but you will see from the State Council to the Ministry of Education to the People's Liberation Army, smoke-free cities, a commission on health set up, national health city standards, the Chinese Academy of Governments, which looks after the civil service, the Ministry of Industry, tax increases, the philanthropy war, even smoking was removed from the cool emoji under the sign of Weibo, a health promotion law. And finally, I have often said that as long as tobacco control remains under the domain of the tobacco industry, which, believe it or not, it was in China, until it shifted to the Ministry of Health, then it's unlikely we would make much more progress. And that's exactly what happened this year. They have removed tobacco control from the clause of the Ministry of Information and Technology. They've removed it from those clauses and put it into the Ministry of Health. And I think all of that work that Richard did in those early days contributed to that. And the second part is just looking at Richard's impact in international policy. And I think it's really important to respect the fact that he coined this global deaths phrase. It's all in one. 20th century, 100 million, the 21st century, 1 billion. That really has had a major impact and shocked many people and many countries into action. In 1995, several of us gathered, and people here today as well, in Bellagio, in the Rockefeller Center. And this was, again, a really important meeting because it put tobacco onto the development agenda. The result of that meeting was tobacco is a major threat to sustainable and equitable development. But perhaps, again, most important in the international arena, in April of 1998, Dr. Brundtland was coming in as the Director General of WHO, and she wanted 2 cabinet projects. One was malaria, it was a done deal. She wanted a second one. And Richard and myself, with Neil Collishaw from WHO, were invited to make a presentation, along with some others on other topics. We were invited to make a presentation to Dr. Brundtland, the incoming Director General, as to why tobacco should be that second cabinet project. And in July that year, when Dr. Brundtland became the Director General, she established tobacco as the cabinet project, and this led to the Tobacco-Free Initiative. It led to Empower, and it ultimately led to the setting up of WHO's one and only convention in terms of international health, the Framework Convention on Tobacco Control, which has now been ratified by 181 countries, making it one of the fastest of all the United Nations ever treaties. And you can see the effect of it. Before and after the FCTC, about 103 countries had done any much work in terms of serious legislation. That changed to 152. And my penultimate slide just shows that some areas have done better than others. We've done better in smoke-free areas. We've done better on labeling, banning advertising, sales to the under 18 and reporting. But we've still got a long way to go on the bottom line, particularly with the tobacco industry. And the tobacco industry really to this day, and this is my last slide, the tobacco industry to this day remains a formidable opponent to tobacco control. And what they have now done, their tactics have really, in a sense, changed from attacking people individually and other ways to really challenging governments now, to the extent that almost if any country now wants to put forward useful legislation or tax increases, they're very likely to fight a challenge. That might be a trade challenge, it might go to the WTO, it might be a constitutional challenge, it might be a challenge in terms of trademarks. But this is what they're now doing. They're trying to obstruct and intervene with all governments taking action. For example, they maneuver to hijack the political and legislative process. They exaggerate the economic importance of the industry. They manipulate public opinion to give the appearance of respectability. They fabricate support through front groups. They discredit proven science and economic evidence. So that's why it's so important to have absolutely solid, reputable science underpinning what we're doing. And they intimidate governments with litigation or the threat of litigation or even trade threats. And I think it's really important to note that none of these threats, and there's been hundreds of them now, none of these threats have ever been successful. One after the other, the courts have thrown them out. So why are they doing this? They're doing it to intimidate. They're doing it to intimidate not just the country concerned, but to actually cast almost a regulatory chill, I would call it, over other countries as well. For example, perhaps if Cambodia were to see that, well, Australia introduced plain packaging and they got 3 legal challenges, how can we, a country like Cambodia, fight against the might of the tobacco industry lawyers? And that's why Bloomberg has set up a fund to try and help countries that are faced with this, and in fact is now moving into looking much more from not forgetting the importance of legislation and taxation and introducing Tom's project in terms of cardiovascular health, but they're moving much more into tackling the tobacco industry, because after all, the tobacco industry is a vector of this epidemic, just as malaria is, the mosquito is a vector of malaria. Tobacco is a vector of this epidemic. And I would just finish by saying that at one time we thought the tobacco industry was unique in being so dreadful, so terrible in the way it behaved, criminally smuggling their own cigarettes, etc. I think we've now come to realize that many of the other industries involved with non-communicable diseases, the food industry, the fast food industry, the sugar industry, alcohol, even the salt industry, is actually beginning to behave in a very similar way. And that's why tobacco is most important, because we've learned our lessons from tobacco in how to actually understand and cope and deal with an industry that is trying to undermine everything that we in public health and epidemiology people are doing. Thank you very much.
We now have a video of some messages from Boston. I presume it's the Bostonian equivalent of Yes Minister.
And so we thought we'd at least get together and reminisce a little bit and wish Richard a successful retirement. I will go back with a story that I was told when I first joined with Richard Dahl and Richard in London, in which somebody who was retiring said that retirement is like a little oil painting. The closer you get to it, the more defects you see. But as you step away from it, it looks better and better. So let's hope for Richard that it will look better and better in the future. A little bit of wine, because wine is good for you, right? I'll tell a little story about Richard that goes back when I first met him 50 years ago. He was just coming to the MRC unit, which Dahl was, and he showed up the first day on his motorcycle with his long hair, and Richard, to my benefit, Richard Dahl assigned him to me to work on a study we were doing with Charles Fletcher on the longitudinal changes in pulmonary function. Richard, I believe, knew from that point on the meaning of big data before the big data concept was actually talked about. He understood what would happen with our studies and longitudinal looking at things. And so I think he was a very important player, certainly in encouraging me current in me to continue to sort of look in that direction. We actually, it was actually Martin Besson and I who started the physicians, doctors' wives study in England. Richard Pito probably would have told us at that time that we had too few women in England to do the study. But in fact, over the years since then, Richard has been a very strong player. The one common story I like to tell is that when Richard and Julian Pito also would ride his motorcycle, they would come to our house in the evening to play bridge. Can you imagine playing bridge with two mathematical statisticians? They would walk us out within an hour.
Good afternoon. I titled my talk, Night of the Living plus Dead. at the supposedly or sort of retirement symposium for Richard. And like many of you, I met Richard early on and was very much impressed by the incredible statistics he was able to share. And one of the most important medical statistics that he shared with me is that 99% of the population is not British. And that led me very much to work with him on global health and global mortality. And I know I'm standing between you and lunch, so I'm going to give you my conclusions first, which are as follows. First, there have been rapid reductions in premature mortality in most populations over the past few decades. And secondly, to outline that counting the dead and describing causes is essential to enable future reductions, particularly for chronic diseases. And I'll give you 4 examples of that: child mortality, malaria, vascular disease, and risk factors, including smoking. Well, starting with the basic survival curve, of which we're all familiar, what has happened extraordinarily is that in England and in Canada, now most of those born can expect to reach age 70, meaning they can reach and survive middle age. My definition of middle changes a little bit as I grow older, but typically I'll use 30 to 70, perhaps 30 to 80. And you see this remarkable transformation that's occurred in England, where 80% of those born can expect to reach age 70. And in developing countries, Ethiopia, India, however, it's still only about half can expect to do so. China has made that transition. And this is a result of 2 things. One is childhood mortality has fallen very rapidly in low and middle income countries, but the completion of child mortality declines is more complete in England. And now the second phenomenon, which is very much central as we move forward to 2030, is the reductions of deaths in middle age. Well, globally, at 1970, about the time that I was born, about 50% at best of the world would reach age 70. Today, it's up to about 70%. And so the key goal, a simplified way of thinking about the 2030 goals, the United Nations goals, is roughly could 80% of all those born reach age 70. And this has been in some work that Richard Norheim and I and others did, been translated in incredible progress, that those deaths before 50 could be halved. But it is also possible that deaths in middle age, 50 to 69, could be reduced by at least by a third. And you heard some of the strategies mentioned in Tom Frieden, and you'll hear more this afternoon on secondary treatment. Well, what's involved in that? Well, let's start with a few things. The first is to obviously avoid man-made epidemics, and here's 3. HIV, that's either ignored or untreated, vodka, and David Zaridze, I'm sure, will touch upon this, and war. So HIV, vodka, war are avoidable causes. Contrast the under 50 mortality rate and the enormous fluctuations that occurred in those 3 conditions versus the declines in most other populations. And if you drew that graph for Iranian women, there would be continuous declines. It was really particular to men. The second idea is to very much understand where the large gaps in evidence occur. And Alan Lopez, to his credit, has been talking about these gaps since 1985, that just simply we do not count enough of where the world's deaths occur and the causes. So broadly, about 48 million deaths that occur worldwide are simply not, or 38 million are not registered, and most countries don't have good enough system. Now, what is the solution for this? Well, one was suggested, in fact, about 140 years ago, almost 140 years ago, by the Sanitary Commissioner of the Government of India, who wrote, and I'll let you read this, "For sanitary purposes, it is indispensable to know the relative mortality in small tract, to ascertain the death rates, and to apply the remedies." Well, effectively, that's what we're doing with the Indian million death study. Now, what we've done here is work with the Registrar General of India to characterize in over 1.4 million randomly selected homes all over the country the patterns of death. And this involves asking simple questions that have been developed by some work by Dr. Gajalakshmi And Dr. Prakash Gupta and others were also involved in helping us set this up. So the basic approach is to ask simple questions by knocking at the door as to what happened, have the work done by non-medical staff, but then have 400 online doctors coding with strict quality assurance, study all diseases, keep things really cheap and able to be sustainable. And thus far, we've studied about 800,000 deaths. And now this solution is expanded to other settings under the statistical lines for vital events, to Sierra Leone, Ethiopia, Mozambique, and elsewhere. So what have we learned from this? Well, the epidemiological adage, if you don't know, you won't look until you are able to carefully examine the patterns, and that's very much true. So we were able to document that there's 1 million smoking deaths, far more than had been estimated by WHO. A lot more malaria deaths than WHO had estimated, but a lot fewer HIV/AIDS deaths than had been the case. Snakebite deaths is a small number of deaths in the grand scheme, 50,000 snakebite deaths, but this is an important one because this was the worldwide estimate by WHO. And this led to the WHO revising its worldwide totals to 100,000, and more importantly, putting snakebite deaths on the list of avoidable or neglected tropical diseases that could be eliminated. More generally, every common disease that is common in one part of India is rare in another, and hence is largely avoidable. There are avoidable risk factors that still await discovery. Let me show you some examples, starting with the first month of life. Now, Richard mentioned that he had seen a sign outside the perinatal epidemiology unit here that said that the first 5 months of life are among the most dangerous in anyone's existence. And someone scribbled under that, the last 5 minutes aren't so great either. The first year of life is important worldwide, but in India there's been extraordinary progress in most conditions. Neonatal mortality has come down substantially. 1 to 59-month mortality has come down substantially in the last 15 years. So this is MDS work based on 100,000 verbal autopsies. Sorry, that should be 100,000, not 10,000. And in essence, the things that got taken seriously was where progress occurred. So there was a national measles program that basically reached quite high coverage, and measles death rates are down 90%. Pneumonia and diet treatment came in and reduced mortality by about 2/3. Malaria, interestingly, as I show you, has been relatively neglected, and hence there's been less progress. In the first month of life, where there was interventions, mainly getting deliveries to occur in facilities, has yielded a substantial reduction in neonatal infections and in birth asphyxia and birth trauma. But interestingly, you see prematurely low birth weights, that's mostly term births with low birth weights, have been rising, but only in the rural and in the poor areas. So hence, these are also avoidable. There's factors that need to be understood as to why these are occurring in some parts of India and not in another. And now the Indian Council of Medical Research has set up a focused group to look at what's going on with term births with low birth weight. Well, what about malaria? This is one of our surprising findings from the million death study, basically showing that there was a U-shaped pattern of malaria. Not that this malaria killed children, which is already established, but it killed a substantial proportion of adults. And that's the U-shaped pattern in 2005. Now, subsequently, the national totals of malaria deaths have come down, but that U-shaped pattern has existed. This was in stark contrast to what WHO had estimated as the malaria death rates, but because WHO relied on its estimates for properly diagnosed malaria patients, it had to have those estimates wrong. If you treat malaria, or if you diagnose malaria, you treat it and you cure it, so you can't actually understand the mortality patterns. And this is important because in parts of Africa where malaria remains common, there is this persistence of this U-shaped pattern. So if you look on the far right, Agincourt, which does not have much malaria, it has no U-shaped pattern. But the other places where malaria remains endemic, sees a U-shaped pattern, suggesting malaria is killing children and adults. And this requires further investigation. Okay, let me turn to the leading cause of death in the world, which is vascular disease, including in India. It's responsible for about a quarter of all deaths. And surprisingly, the risks of ischemic heart disease are rising in middle age in India. In 2000, about 10% of men could expect to drop dead from heart attack. It's up to 13%. In women, 5 to 7%. There have been modest decreases in stroke, but this masks some unexpected heterogeneity in the distribution of stroke. So ischemic heart disease is mostly concentrated in the south of India and pockets of the north, but stroke has a very unique pattern. A third of all the strokes occur in a sixth of the population in the northeast. And these stroke rates in those areas are 3 times those of the national areas. And moreover, in rural areas, ischemic heart disease rates have been rising nationally and in the high burden stroke rates from stroke, but falling in the low burden states. Now, we don't know the reasons for this yet. This requires further investigation, but one of the plausible factors might be that there are important factors, particularly for ischemic heart disease, that operate at low levels of body mass index, which is the patterns in India, that need investigation. Okay, let me turn to risk factors, because going forward to 2030, we'd have to understand risk factors as well as the patterns of mortality. And let me start with somewhat of an esoteric one, which is Indian vegetarianism, which is peculiar because it's a lifelong pattern typically. And here you see the pockets of parts of India that are vegetarian in the green, and in the purple are those that are non-vegetarian. So mostly it's up in the northeast. And what do we find when we look at vegetarian mortality? Well, effectively no overall protection on all-cause mortality. But the interesting story very much is in cardiac mortality. And for young men and young women, in fact, there's a slight excess risk of being a vegetarian. And this is particularly interesting when you look at the risks in men, so slight risk, a relative risk of 1.1. In women, it's a little higher, 1.16. But interestingly, in wives, it's even bigger, 1.43. Now, why is that? Well, what we speculate is that what vegetarianism is a pointer to is basically the amount of overall caloric intake, but also the proportion of that that is mostly driven by carbohydrate. The women eat whatever is left at the end of the day when particularly much of the proteins and fats have already been consumed. So this is an interesting pattern that we're exploring further. Okay, let me turn to smoking. As already been alluded, is probably the most important and actionable risk factor to concern. On drinking, I won't spend much time doing that. I know David is going to be touching upon this, but I think the key message for drinking is don't drink like a Russian. Aside from smoking will be causing is unique. But let's start with obesity. Well, obesity is sometimes called the new tobacco, but it is very different. As you've seen now, prolonged smokers can expect to lose a decade of life. And that decade of life can be produced by obesity, but it requires quite severe obesity, about a body mass index of 43. So in my case, it'd be putting on 50 kilograms to get the decade of life lost that you would get from being a typical smoker. In most populations, the level of obesity is much more modest, leading to perhaps about 3 years of lost life. So still, at a population level, smoking does remain more important than obesity. Surprisingly, the 21st century hazards that Mike Toon referred to in his video have only been really sorted out quite surprisingly recently. At the 2012 Richard Dahl Symposium, many of us met and compared notes, and we found this remarkable consistency about a decade of life lost across populations. So the top is the UK doctor study, the UK Million Women study by Valerie Perel and Christian Puri. These are, in the middle, our US prospective study, Japanese atomic bomb survivors, and our Indian retrospective studies. And this is how Brian Williams from the NBC network summarized our findings. Well, they say power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. Are we there? Okay, if you can make that work, we'll show it.
And good news and bad news on the smoking front from the New England Journal of Medicine. They state flat out smokers lose at least 1 decade of life expectancy over non-smokers on average. The encouraging news here is quitting before 40 reduces the smoking-related death risk by 90% compared to continuing on as a smoker. And good news and bad news.
That's Richard Peto's career in 22 seconds. So some details from the U.S. matter. So these are the U.S. prospective data. And what we looked at was the probability of death between 25 to 80. You can't live forever, but living till age 80 in good health is a fair proposition. And you see this extraordinary divergence between a typical smoker and a non-smoker. 70% of non-smokers can expect to reach age 80 versus only 38% of current smokers, adjusted for the usual differences that you do carefully in epidemiology. Well, this also gives us a framework for thinking about the maturing hazards in other populations. And China and India are the most important here, each with about 1 million deaths. But the patterns are very different. In India, most of the men, up until recently, that smoked cigarettes, smoked BDIs, which are small local cigarettes, and they lose 6 years of life. Women who smoke BDIs, but there's few of them, lose 8 years, and the men who smoke cigarettes, the Western cigarettes, lose the full decade of life. Now, the cigarettes have been displacing the BDIs over time, and as a result, the relative risks between smoker and non-smoker are becoming slightly more extreme. Tom is absolutely right, the smoking prevalence has gone down, but the relative risks between smoker and non-smoker are becoming more extreme. Now, the good news is that because smoking is so hazardous, quitting is ridiculously beneficial. If you quit by 30, you get back almost 10 years of lost life. Quit by 40, get back 9. Even quitting by 60 returns about 4 years of life. The single most effective intervention to reduce tobacco is, of course, tobacco taxation. And this is a nice example from France that Catherine Hill shared with Richard and I. And you look at the extraordinary change that's occurred in consumption. And the French were able to have consumption from 6 cigarettes per adult per day down to 3 in only 15 years. In the UK, that halving took about 30 years, in Canada about 35. And the reason is that the French took much higher taxation far more seriously and raised the taxes substantially. Now, taxes are, of course, important, but there are other interventions that are coming to place. Australia has adopted these new plain packaging in which the only advertisement for the brand is that small label there. And in Canada, we've used these labels quite effectively, including this one. And there's studies that if you hand a pack of this to a man, he'll say, no, give me the one that kills me. I much prefer that than this one. So they are noticing it. Now, I've given you lots of numbers, and again, I apologize. My wife jokes that says, you know, epidemiologists are just accountants. You just crunch numbers. And I said, that's not fair. Accountants have more personality. But I did want to leave you not with a quantitative conclusion, but just 2 qualitative ones. The first is that it continues to be that most global deaths in early life and in middle age are avoidable. And I hope I've convinced you to help the living count the dead. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much to all the speakers, and particularly since we finished very, very close to time. Before we do break for lunch, just a couple of announcements. It's impossible to summarize a set of talks like that. But I hope you, like me, have come away with this feeling of the extraordinary legacy that the science that Richard Peto has led on tobacco and the impact that that has had on global public policy. In my view, Richard Peto is the most influential analytical epidemiologist of our time. But not known to many of you is that Richard also has a tremendous regard for the science of descriptive epidemiology and has been a huge supporter of the global burden of disease studies that I've been working on for 3 decades. And in fact, when we released the very first GBD study, he insisted that we give a talk to the Royal Society and organised, I think, 500 or 600 people at the Royal Society. And I was kicking this off with an introduction. I was tapping on the microphone saying, "Can you hear me?" And he stood up in the front row and said, "Yes, I can, but I'll gladly change places with someone who can't." So, you know, I've had a fascinating 30 years with Richard Peto, and not much has changed. So a wonderful recognition of the role that Richard has played in all of our lives, including tobacco. Now, a few administrative announcements. Lunch is outside the lecture theatre, and there are 3 separate places where you can obtain food. But please, please, do not take food into the museum or on the ground floor. So please don't do that. The next session starts promptly at 1:30. Thank you very much again to all the speakers.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. And so the microphone's not on yet?
No.
Okay. Okay.
Just at the end,
I've just heard there's a book, there's a present for him.
There's a guest book for people to write in.
Will I say that now? Or?
No, say that at the break.
I've just been told that there's... Okay, folks. It's not on yet. And they turn me on. Okay, folks. No, it's not on yet. No, he's going to turn me on. I'm not on yet. His family. So, front few rows are just full of Richard's extended family. So we welcome you there. And the only explanation I have is that they're just more than 24 hours in Richard's day, because he does manage to do lots of things. Now, we've also heard these Richard's sort of mantras: concentrate on the big data, make sure you really know and can quantify known risk factors, and so forth. But there are a couple of, well, I've always wondered, I mean, you don't sort of get to that idea without formulating in some way yourself. And I've tried to talk to Richard on occasion about how did you sort of come up with these approaches and these ideas. And you know, he's enormously inarticulate when it comes to explaining where he got there. And what he says is usually, as far as I'm concerned, completely implausible. Like he just says, oh, everyone was saying that, and I just did what everyone else was doing. And we know that's not true. So the only way, I think, we've got to begin to think about this young Richard Peto, and these are completely my ideas, and it's wonderful to be able to talk about Richard and know that he's not allowed to answer back, or he's not on the program. But if you look back at so I've only got his scientific publications. I didn't know him then. And if you go back, Richard spent at least 10 years. Richard started working in 1968 with Richard Doll in it was then the statistics unit, and MRC statistics unit in London. And at that time, because I was around at the time at the School of Hygiene, and just thinking on causes of cancer and way of preventing cancer was really quite confused. And it was, and in particular, epidemiology was really emerging as a discipline. There were a lot of multi-stage models, which Peter Armitage started with Richard Doll. There are a number of approaches trying to understand causes of cancer, what caused cancer. And then there was also a growing belief that the only way we can understand the cause of cancer is doing animal experiments and various mutagenicity tests. And Richard wrote this paper in 1976, which summarised, I hope I've got the summary of it right, but that basically, when you look at a species level, the incidence of cancer doesn't appear to correlate very well with the number of cells in an organisation. And I've just quoted here, because I don't want to get my quote wrong, so I've quoted from something Richard wrote in 2015. He says, so gram for gram, human tissue is in some real sense about 3 trillion times less susceptible to cancer induction than mouse tissue. And I don't know whether, you might even wonder why he was writing that in 2015. And the reason is that actually, those observations, that thinking about the difference in susceptibility to cancer across different species, is called and is known as, and many of you don't know, is the Peto's paradox. And there's a whole, if you go on Wikipedia, there's a whole section about the Peto paradox. And it actually triggered, there's a whole field of investigation, I think that no one here represents, trying to understand this massive difference in susceptibility to cancer across the different species. And this picture is from the front page of a volume just called Cancer Across Life, Peto's Paradox and the Promise of Comparative Oncology, looking at mechanisms to try and explain this. And Richard wrote the foreword to it, which is what I quoted from. So anyway, this is just to show that Richard actually, there's even more to Richard's work than just the stuff that we're talking about. Now, another thing that really arose from that work, and I don't really I'm not going to even claim to try and explain it, is that Richard has this another mantra that often quoted, you can see in a whole lot of papers that he's written across the decades, is there is no such thing as aging. And he wrote when I showed Richard this picture, I was trying to sort of trace things, and Richard said, I remember that. That's when I was writing with Dole for an editorial for the BMJ called There's No Such Thing as Aging, and that old age, this had a bit of an explanation, old age is associated with disease but doesn't cause it. But if you go right back to his writings, 1975, and again in 86 with Sarah Parrish, who's somewhere in the audience, Richard Gray, who's on holiday at the moment, but still work with Richard. This is a recurring theme, another one of the Peto mantras that's not as well known as a lot of the other ones. And it's rather unfortunate, because if the university knew that, we wouldn't be here today, because they wouldn't have made Richard retire at a certain age. And so we have to wait, and one day, maybe you young people in the audience, one day Oxford University will start saying there is no such thing as aging and you can stay on and work if you want. But that's why we're here, because the University of Oxford administrators don't really understand things properly. So anyway, so Richard was really interested was obviously thinking, and I was going to say another thing that, and so this was obviously going around in Richard's mind, trying to understand what to do, what causes cancer and how do you prevent cancer. And another thing I was going to mention, I should have mentioned earlier, is that I'm pretty sure that this idea was in Richard's mind all the time. And again, I think it's to do with his family background. It's no secret that his family were active and very vocal communists in the 40s and 50s, not later, and encouraged children to really think for themselves and talk and argue from a very young age. And I think it's the idea that you have to do something, and particularly this idea that you're here, that one of your goals in life has to make the world better and to improve life for human beings. I think that's always been behind Richard as well, and I think there's some of the drives. But really, in a way, the visible change in terms of publications came with this book with Richard Dole, published in 1981, which was also published as a volume in the Journal of the National Cancer Institute, The Causes of Cancer, Quantitative Estimates of Avoidable Risks of Cancer in the United States Today. Now, I'm sure at this point, almost everyone in the audience would know of this work. It was hugely influential, and it seems to sort of just reflect this change from thinking about animals, realizing that if you want to understand causes, this is my interpretation, if you want to understand cause of cancer in humans, you have to study humans, and it's an absolutely, now I'm just, it's a absolutely fantastic analysis, really, and all the other presentations are about risk factors, trying to understand what causes it, but it's not just what causes cancer, but how big are the effects of different things, and what's the range of uncertainty in what we know. Now, I'm not going through any of this now, but I just want to say that this is, in a way, it's the published beginning of, I think, a lot of work of the future. And it really has inspired not just us, but we were Richard and I were at Public Health England just a couple of weeks ago, and the chief medical officer there in the Public Health England said to Richard, you know, it was reading that book or that article that made me think I was a medical student then or just graduating, and that's when I decided to go into public health. And that's just something that happened 2 weeks ago. But I think you would find right around the world large numbers of people who moved into public health and prevention and such because of this work. And the thing about this is it seems, this is almost 40 years ago, it seems very novel now to try and work out what are the sort of cause of cancer and of other conditions. But this was absolutely, to my mind, he'll probably disagree, but quite revolutionary at the time. No one had really approached cancer prevention in that way. It was a completely different approach to thinking about cancer in humans and what to do about it. And now we've got even going to Alan's work on the global burden of disease, trying to attribute different diseases to different causes. It started with this. It was and this is 40 years ago. So I think that we have to, I think this was one of the, one can see how he got there and I know it was with Dollar, and they clearly worked together all the time and closely, and everything was definitely jointly done. But just bringing that together was, I think Richard had a lot to do with it. And this is my last slide actually, and it's showing, and again, this has been mentioned before, the 50-year follow-up of the British doctor study, and this is a picture of Richard Dole and Richard Peto. And this was taken in the Richard Dole building, which was not finished at that time. And they had a special ceremony, I think it was called the topping out ceremony, and Richard Dole had to go up and lay the final brick on the top or something. And see, they kept having ceremonies all the time. Was already in his 90s, and in fact, he died a year and a half, I think, after this picture was taken. But we had these ceremonies, and this was an occasion where Richard Dole was the guest of honour. And this Richard Peto took him aside when all these guests were gathered to talk to Richard Dole, took him aside with these data and showed him, and it was some of the new analyses done of the British doctor study that was published in June 2004 in the end, which was 50 years after the first publication, the follow-up of the British doctor study. And they were having, and Rory alluded to this, that they were very close, but they weren't obsequious to each other in any way. And they were clearly having a big argument. It was friendly, but there was tension. And I remember saying to Richard, because I thought it was quite impolite to take Richard Dole away from an occasion where he was the guest, or the main guest, and also that he was, because I said to Richard, what's up now? He said, he's wrong. And I said, but Richard Dole's study, he said he didn't like, I can't remember what it was. Anyway, I said, it's Richard Dole's study was started 50 years ago. He's in his 90s, for heaven's sake. Give him a bit of, space. And Richard said, when I'm old, I want people to argue with me if I'm wrong. So that's the message to all of you. You just argue with Richard. And then, no, I've got one more, whoops, I've gone off. No, I have got one more slide. But it is the introduction, but it does follow on from this in a way. I've got one more slide, which is an introduction to the video by Francis Collins, who probably all of you know is the director of the US National Institutes of Health. And his video is called Making the Case for Large Cohort Studies. Well, I just want to point out that in this publication, Cause of Cancer, in 1981, I've even given the page number, if you're not sure, you can check. A large step forward, they're talking about the future epidemiology, what to do next to understand the causes of cancer or anything else. A large step forward would be the establishment for public use by bona fide medical research workers of a bank of blood and perhaps other biological samples and an open-ended questionnaire. Seems a bit odd, but there you are. From at least a few 100,000 apparently healthy people whose names would be linked to the National Death Index, because that's all people had then at their disposal. So it seems that 40 years on, NIH are taking this seriously. So that's what we're going to hear now. Okay, now the video.
We're delighted to join you in paying tribute to Richard's contributions as one of the most influential epidemiologists of our time. Looking over all the amazing talks on today's program,
Thanks. Again, I think we'll stick by the principle of actually not introducing people. You can read about Sarah in the book. She has worked with Richard for possibly, I don't want to say decades, let's say. And so I think Sarah will just introduce herself and talk about her work.
Yes, so I've been working with Richard for 23 years now and still smiling. So I'm going to be talking, we couldn't have a symposium for Richard without talking about halving premature death. And you've already heard Prabhat Jha say that only 1% of the population lives in the UK. And so my talk is going to be about the other 99%. We've already heard, and you know, that evidence from high-income countries, it's now well established that the major modifiable causes of vascular mortality are blood pressure and blood lipids, adiposity and diabetes, and tobacco. But of course that seems obvious now, but it's not always been obvious, and it was really due to attention to statistical detail in the latter half of the 20th century that we really got to the right relationships. The title of my dissertation was Blood Pressure, Blood Cholesterol and Mortality, the Real Relationships. And one of the few corrections I had to make was that Rory, who was one of the examiners, and Stephen McMahon felt it was maybe a little bold and that it should be towards the real relationships. Well, I hope that we are now getting to the real relationships, at least in high-income countries. But it really is due to the attention to statistical details. And I thought, Richard, you might have heard enough about how wonderful you are today, and the audience may have heard enough, so I'm not going to say anything other than it is due to your attention to statistical detail, and if I've learnt anything, I've learnt the importance of that if we want to get to the real relationships, to the right relationships, we've got to avoid bias, we've got to avoid reverse causality deaths. And importantly, work that you did with Rory and Stephen McMahon and others on blood pressure and stroke in the 1990s, the importance of assessing the effects of the long-term average or the so-called usual levels of exposure, and how all previous studies where they just cared a baseline, a single measurement of... So I hope, if nothing else, Richard, you appreciate the font type and size of my presentation. So I came to Oxford in 1995 to work on the Prospective Studies collaboration. I naively thought that would be a 3-year DPhil project, and I'd sort of waltz out of Oxford with several publications under my belt. But in 2002, we did publish, and it really was a journey from the initial findings of this collaboration that we presented to collaborators in 1996. And we had results that it was the right shape, but the presentation wasn't quite right, and Richard kept saying, well, it'll do. And again, in my naivety, I thought, it'll do. But actually what it meant was that we've got another 6 years before we get these results in a state that can be published. But boy, was it worth it, because this paper has now been cited, I think the last time I looked, over 10,000 times. It really did make a difference, the presentation of that. So we got together 61 studies, 1 million adults, 34,000 CHD deaths. So we had the big numbers, and we had enough numbers that we could remove people with prior disease. We could remove the early follow-up. And importantly, we could look age specifically. And then when we looked at that, with those 34,000 deaths, we saw these remarkably consistent straight lines, not only in old age, not only at high blood pressure, but throughout the range, with no level of blood pressure below which lower blood pressure was not associated with lower risk. And again, we've heard this statistic quoted several times today, that this is now accepted as a fact, or considered a fact, that in middle age, 20 millimeters of mercury systolic blood pressure approximately doubles the risk of vascular mortality. 5 years later, we published on cholesterol, and again, the same thing, about 2 millimoles per litre, higher total cholesterol approximately doubles the risk. BMI, and this was work done by John Dinesh and colleagues in Boston, and they decided that they wanted to get to the bottom of the obesity story, the so-called obesity paradox, is there really no, there was publications suggesting that actually there was no increase in risk until the BMI of 30. So, having learned from Richard as a PhD student, he knew he had to get big numbers, he knew he had to avoid reverse causality, etc., etc. And so, restricted to never smokers and with no prior disease, excluding early follow-up, John collected data on BMI from around the world. He collected data on 10 million adults, 4 million of which had never smoked, 55,000 deaths. And by doing that, he showed, again, reliably, that if overweight, not obese, but if overweight, every 10 kilograms per meter squared doubles the risk. And then just finally moving on to smoking, work with Valerie Burrell and the Million Women Study, or the 1.3 million women study, as it should be called, looking at vascular mortality by the amount smoked, and showing that even light smoking doubles the risk. Even smoking just 5 cigarettes a day doubles the risk of vascular mortality if you smoke consistently throughout adulthood. And so I think I've convinced you that the evidence from high-income countries is there and it's reliable. But of the 30 million premature deaths each year, 7 million of which are due to cardiovascular disease, 80% of those are in low and middle-income countries. And Richard recognised this in the 1990s, and I think sort of while they wandered around global conferences and met people from these low and middle income countries who were passionate about doing epidemiology in their own country and passionate about doing big epidemiology in their own country. And so Richard worked with these people. They recognised that these large studies were needed around the world to look what's happening. That's what's happening in high income countries, what's happening around the world. And over the last 6 or 7 years, I've been lucky enough to be involved in some of these large studies that Richard has helped support, both financially and intellectually, both to get going and to successfully follow up. So there are now 5 studies, 1.5 million adults in those studies. All of them are successfully following up for mortality. On average, about 15 years follow-up in these studies. And importantly, Richard persuaded everybody that these studies are no use without a resurvey. We can't get to the real relationships unless we have a resurvey to know what is the extent of that regression dilution bias. And you've heard from you'll hear from all of these studies, and it's a real delight to know that all of the people listed on this, all except one listed on this slide, were able to come and to be here and to present today. So we needed study. We've now got studies with different exposures, different diseases all around the world. We've got 0.6 million people. Dr. Gajalakshmi's got 0.6 million, 600,000 people in India, 500,000 of those in a rural area. They're lean, very few diabetics. Dr. Shenoy in the southwest of India, in Trivandrum, has got a study of 400,000 men, both urban and rural. Professor Zaridzi, who you'll hear from, will talk about the hazardous drinking and the effects of that. We can only look at that in Russia. If we want to know what the hazardous effects of drinking are going to be in the UK, the best place to study that is in Russia. And you've already seen results from Richard's student Blake Thompson on smoking in Cuba, where many start before the age of 12, but also in Mexico, where diabetes is common and often poorly controlled. So why do we need to study in different parts of the world? Why can't we assume that what's happening in the UK, in the US, is happening all around the world? I'll just remind you of the findings from John Dinesh from the Global BMI, where if overweight, 10 kilograms per meter squared doubled the risk. So we thought we'd look at that in Chennai, where the mean BMI is 23 kilograms per meter squared. Again, with the same attention to detail, excluding early follow-up, excluding prior disease, in the non-smokers. And actually what one would expect is that given there's evidence that at a given BMI, South Asians have lower body fat than people of European origin, that maybe this whole curve will be shifted to the left. But actually, what we found was that there appears to be little or no association between BMI and cardiac mortality in Chennai. So when we first present this finding to Richard, the first thing we have to do is to go back and check the programming was okay. The programming worked. The programming did work. And also, and we knew that because we looked at BMI versus blood pressure. So in Chennai, BMI is associated with blood pressure about the same as it is in the West. And blood pressure is associated with cardiac mortality as it is in the West. So why are we seeing no association? We think the BMI measurements, therefore, must be working. The death coding must be working. So why are we seeing no association between BMI and cardiac mortality in Chennai? And in fact, what this suggests is that at a given level of usual blood pressure, BMI is inversely related to cardiac mortality in this population. And we were talking with Dr. Gajalakshmi yesterday about plans to investigate this further. What might be causing this apparent inverse association? It can't all be confounding with socioeconomic status because we've looked at that. It can't be smoking because this is among the non-smokers. So what is it in this South Asian population about having a low BMI that's associated with higher risk? Sorry. Moving on to Mexico, the study was set up to look at smoking, but actually diabetes is a huge problem in Mexico, and this is a study done by Jesus Alegre and Pablo Curi in collaboration. It was set up in the 1990s with Richard and Rory and is now run by John Emerson, who I can't see in the audience but is here. But what they found is that diabetes is a huge problem in Mexico. And again, John, you're getting a lot of mentions here, but the Emerging Risk Factors collaboration in 2011 showed that at least in high-income countries with reasonably good glycemic control, diabetes approximately doubles overall mortality. But what about in low and middle-income countries where resources to manage that diabetes may be more limited, and particularly the vascular protective treatments, the statins, the blood pressure lowering, might be underused? So here are findings that were published in the New England Journal in 2016, diabetes and all-cause mortality. Among those, importantly, again, that attention to detail, among those without other chronic disease at baseline. And diabetes is a huge problem in Mexico. At age 60, approximately 20% of men and women will have diabetes. How does that translate into risk? Well, again, the findings were striking. 5-fold risk among people in early middle age who had diabetes, 5 times more likely to die than those who don't have diabetes. And so this translates into about 1/3 of all deaths in Mexico, all premature deaths in Mexico due to diabetes. And an important finding here, similar for men and women. So again, unlike in the high-income countries, not only does diabetes seem to be more likely to kill you, it seems to do so equally among men and women. So can we halve premature mortality? I think we can, but it will require lifestyle changes and the prolific use of cost-effective generics, in particular the statins and the blood pressure lowering. But we need to continue to do these large studies in different countries if we're really going to understand not only the current, but also the future effects of these major causes of death in low and middle income countries. And you heard from Tom Frieden earlier how he and his colleagues are using the data that have been produced from these large epidemiological studies to inform both their global burden of for Alan, the global burden of disease estimates, and for the global hearts, for their policies and their technical packages. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sarah. The next talk is Gaja. We call her Dr. Gaja Lakshmi, I can't quite say it, from Chennai, who has been working again with Richard for many decades and is going to talk about her study of 500,000 people in Chennai. And we've already seen some of the results for BMI. And I think, well, while she's getting set up, it's No Smoke Without Fire, Tales from India. Gaja.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everyone. I am Gajalashmi, epidemiologist working in Chennai, South India. I first met Richard Peto in 1994 at the International Cancer Congress in New Delhi. Both of us were speakers in a symposium on clinical trials. And then during lunch break, we were talking about the studies going on in India. And then Richard Peto said, would you like to do studies on tobacco in Tamil Nadu? I said, yes. And then he wanted to know whether I'm interested in case control or cohort studies. I said both. And then I established case control studies in Chennai, one study in Chennai, that is urban area, and another one in Viluppuram with 80,000 adult deaths and 80,000 controls. And third study was on smoking and drinking, that is with living men, 3,000 tuberculosis cases, confirmed cases from the hospitals. And we took population controls living in the same villages. And then I have two cohort studies which are going on now in Tamil Nadu. One in Chennai, that is with 500,000 adults, that is 500,000, age 35 plus. And another one in Viluppuram, that is rural area, with 100,000 adults, age 35 plus. So we did verbal autopsy. Why are we doing verbal autopsy in Tamil Nadu? Because cause of death on the death certificate is unknown or non-specific for about 50% of deaths. So we developed a tool, VA tool, to assign probable underlying cause of death. So this shows results. We reviewed 80,000 VA reports in 3 years, 1998 to 2000. The result shows we were able to assign cause of death for 90% of deaths in early and middle age and 80% of deaths at all ages. It also reduces deaths from unspecified cause in all ages from 50% to 20%. And we are able to assign the cause when none is reported. So we presented these results to RGI, who is the Registrar General of India, who is the Census Commissioner and in charge of births and deaths for the country. And also to the census directors, they are in charge of collecting deaths for the country. And they were all convinced about the methodology, and RGI has agreed and implemented the methodology for nationwide for 15 plus, because the methodology which I developed is only for 25 plus. So it can be used from 15 plus. So these are the results for the first two case control studies, one in Chennai, another one in Viluppuram, with 80,000 adult deaths and 80,000 controls. So this is urban, this is rural risk ratio, and this is smoking associated, urban and rural. So you can see twofold risk of dying from neoplasm. And this translates to 35% of deaths attributed to smoking. Whereas for tuberculosis, it is fourfold risk, and it translates to 50 to 60% of deaths from tuberculosis is attributed to smoking. We didn't expect this result, and it was a very surprise to us. And then we did the type of smoking and tuberculosis. See, if they smoke cigarette, the risk is threefold. And if they smoke BD, it is sixfold. So 15% of deaths were attributed to BD and 22% in cigarette. In Chennai, among smokers, 75% smoke cigarettes, only 25% smoke BDs. So whatever studies we have done for the past 25 years, only BDs have higher risk than cigarettes. And then in Viluppuram, so risk associated with cigarette is twofold and BD 4.2-fold. And here, 75% of smokers smoke BD and only 25% smoke cigarettes. And third study on smoking and drinking, this is with 3,000 TB cases, confirmed one. The previous study, we have taken the dead people and got the diagnosis based on verbal autopsy, whereas these are confirmed TB cases. And this shows that 2 to 3-fold risk of developing TB among smokers and 2-fold risk of developing TB among drinkers. If they have both the habit, the risk is 4-fold. This cohort study, I'm going to show you the results of only Chennai cohort. It is a house-to-house survey in Chennai. We started in 1998 and completed in 2001. We have recruited 500,000 adults, that is 500,000 adults, age 35 plus. It is almost 1/3 of the Chennai population. And we trained university graduates to collect data. And then whatever data coming from the field is garbage. You have to clean it. You have to check for the quality. So we focus on quality control. We checked all performa for consistency and completeness. And then we coded the data and entered it twice in the computer to avoid any entry errors. And then we repeated the interview and measurements for about 5% of the output. Follow-up, we have two methods. One is active, another one is passive. So in active follow-up, we send our field workers to the houses again to find out whether the person is alive or dead. If dead, they write verbal autopsy report. If alive, they ask, are they suffering from any illness like TB, diabetes, cancer, stroke, asthma, and then they note it down. And for passive follow-up, we are linking our database with the deaths registered in the corporation. But it is not easy task because I am not getting the data in the electronic media. So I have to download all the deaths that occur every day. That is about 35,000 deaths per year that we save in the computer. And then we match it with our 500,000 records. Out of 500,000, now 80,000 dead. So we have to match with 420,000 records manually. There is no program. It is impossible to develop a program for our matching because our names are spelled differently, it is written differently. Sometimes they write last name as a first name as a last name. So it is not possible to match it through programs. And then we resurveyed. After 14 years of initial survey, we interviewed and measured 10,000 men. This is death and smoking in Tamil Nadu. The analysis is restricted only to men because smoking is about only less than 1% among females. So we analyzed only men. So for cancer, you see 2-4 risk of dying from cancer, and for tuberculosis also 2-fold. For vascular, it is 1.4-fold, and overall, only medical causes, it is 1.33. This slide shows at initiation. So the age, the greater the risk. When we did the study, the mean age at initiation was 22. CDC conducted nationwide survey in 2010, and they reported now smoking and drinking versus all-cause mortality. If they smoke only, the risk is 1.4. If they drink only, it is 1.5. If they do both, then the risk is 2-fold. So SBP and vascular, BMI, and all these are touched upon by Sarah. So highlights, 20 millimeters of mercury, lowering 20 millimeters of mercury, SBP, halves vascular mortality. BMI had little effect on vascular mortality, and low BMI at a given blood pressure was hazardous. In men, both smoking and drinking were associated with substantial excess mortality during middle age. Both smoking and drinking are independent risk factors. Smoking contributes to half the male TB deaths in India at ages 25 to 69. A total deaths is 0.4 million from TB. Out of this, 0.2 million attributed to smoking. The VA2 developed for Tamil Nadu studies has been adapted and used nationwide for 15 plus by RGI. Thank you.
Thank you, Gaja. We're now moving across the continents, and we've got, well, it's the same across the continents, David Zaritsky from Russia, who is going to talk about saving Russian lives one step at a time.
Yes. Okay, thank you. Rory, Sarah, thank you very much for organizing this beautiful meeting, but I'm not happy with the title of the meeting. You know that Richard Dole retired 3 times. Therefore, I would preferably to call this symposium dedicated to Richard Pito's first retirement, and I'm looking forward to seeing all of you at the symposiums of Richard Pito's second and third retirement. Thank you. I have to start with what everybody has started. I know Richard for 40 years. He may correct me saying that we know each other for 41 years. In 1977, I spent 6 months as a fellow of International Agency for Research on Cancer in Richard Dole's Department of Regius Professor of Medicine. Since then, I have and had privilege to work with Richard on several scientific projects which had and have major impact on prevention of premature deaths in Russia. This is a famous quotation of Richard Dole's statement. You know everybody this statement, but I would like to draw your attention to it, especially because it is most relevant to Russia. Unfortunately, the majority of Russian men die before they reach old age. This is a slide which shows the trends. I'm sorry, this is not a slide. So I would like to start with alcohol, and I would like to show this slide, which shows changes, fluctuations, ups and downs in Russian mortality over the past 30 years. We have related them to certain political and social events, economic events, positive or negative, which we had and have in abundance in Russia recently. To explore causes of high mortality in Russia, we set up with Richard, that was Richard's initiative. Before starting this study, we discussed it nearly for several years at several occasions. And we set up with Richard a large epidemiological research project. It includes retrospective study and prospective studies and the analysis of 25,000 autopsies. So you see that retrospective case control mortality study included 500,000 deaths. Prospective cohort study included 210,000 healthy individuals, healthy men and women. And autopsy study included the analysis of causes of death of 25,000 deceased. On this right side of this slide, you see the results of retrospective cohort study. As you see, the drinking of more than 3 bottles of vodka per week was associated with increased risk of dying from 8 medical causes and practically all non-medical causes. Medical causes include cancers of upper digestive tract, liver cancer, tuberculosis, pneumonia, non-MI acute ischemic heart disease, liver disease, pancreatic disease, ill-specified diseases. Based on this analysis, we calculated alcohol attributable mortality, and in young men, alcohol caused nearly 60% of deaths. In older men, aged 55 to excessive hazardous drinking caused more than 22% of deaths. The cohort study completely showed similar results, and you see on this slide that the baseline alcohol consumption strongly predicted all-cause mortality among males. Estimated 20-year risk of dying from cancer was 16% in men who drank less than 1 bottle of vodka, more 15% in those men who drank from 1 to 3 bottles of vodka, and 35% in men who drank more than 3 bottles of vodka weekly. The association was also observed with amount of vodka drunk in men aged 55 to 74. As you see here, the association was not as strong, but those who drank, men who drank less than 1 bottle of vodka, the risk of dying from 20 years risk of death was 50%, and increased in those who drank from 1 to 3 bottles of vodka to 54%, and those men who drank more than 3 bottles of vodka, risk of death was 64%. So the results of these studies have been published in Lancet and in other, and also in Lancet and some other journal, international, but also in Russian medical journals. These results, in fact, played a decisive role in setting up the alcohol control program in Russia. Russia has implemented a number of WHO recommended measures to control alcohol consumption, including raising excise duties, banning advertisement, restricting retail sales, setting minimum prices, banning night sales, fighting illegal production, and so on. And all these measures, led to decrease in alcohol sales, in alcohol consumption. Here you see the graphs showing the decrease in sales of alcohol. This curve shows the sales of all types of alcohol, and green curve shows decrease in strong drinks, in vodka. And these changes, these decreases in alcohol consumption resulted in decrease in mortality, very important decrease in mortality from all causes, from cardiovascular diseases, from external causes and external causes. The decrease in Russian mortality since 2005 has already saved some 3,500 lives in Russia. Now I would like to turn to tobacco, but I have to go now back to the 1985. At that time, I was working in the epidemiology unit of the International Agency for Research on Cancer. We met with Richard for several occasions in different parts of the world and talked on tobacco smoking in Russia and its effects on cancer and health in general. On this slide, you see the trends in lung cancer mortality in Russia, left men, right women. As you see, this is a point, 1985. And at that, there was a steep increase in mortality from lung cancer from 1965 until 1992. At this point, British, UK, and Russian curves cross. As you see, Russian mortality, lung cancer mortality goes up. British, UK cancer mortality goes down. In 1915, the mortality will come, there will be a 40% decrease in mortality between 1993 and 2015. You know, the situation, like the mortality trends, lung cancer mortality trends in women are a bit different. Russian women traditionally don't smoke much. And also they started smoking later than women in Western countries. Anyway, we see slight increase in mortality between 65 and 93, and then we see some decrease and some decrease, and then flattening. The curve is becoming flat. These are trends in cigarette sales in Russia. As you see, cigarette sales increase gradually. In 1984, it reached 300 billion pieces. Sales reached 300 billion pieces. But this was due to and then we see the decline in sales of cigarettes in Russia. This decline in legal cigarette sales was caused by shortage in all consumers' goods, including cigarettes. However, legal cigarette shortage was compensated by illegal sales, illegal tobacco sales. And then, after the from 1991, the tax regulation of alcohol and tobacco was completely ruined in Soviet Union, in Russia, and this flat curve is showing. Well, it shows the flattening trends in legal sales. Since 1998, the sales of cigarettes in Russia increased, and it reached some 400,000 billions of pieces. Richard noticed in 1985, he noticed that the Russian cigarettes may have a very high levels of tar and nicotine. And we get 40 brands of Russian cigarettes analyzed and discovered that in 45% of them, tar concentration was above 25 milligrams per cigarette. And in 65% of them, nicotine concentration, nicotine deliveries were more than 50 milligrams per cigarette. So, in 1985, In 1985, we had a meeting in Moscow, which was organized by International Agency for Research on Cancer. This was a very important meeting. That was, in fact, the first meeting which addressed problem of smoking tobacco in Soviet Union. Richard Dole was a honorary chair of the president of the meeting, and Richard and myself, we organized it. And we drafted the recommendations, which in one complementary approach, complementary recommendation addressed tar and nicotine levels in Russian cigarettes. By that time, Richard Dole and Richard Pito published a paper in which they noticed that there was a decline in lung cancer mortality in young men. And they